already, but I'm going to bring back the spirit of Halloween for a few minutes. How many people in the audience plan to donate their body to science? A few. How many of you would like to undergo surgery at the hands of a doctor who would never dissected a human being? In 1875, the Evening Star reported, "The fact that human bodies are required by medical colleges in the study of anatomy is pretty well known, and the necessity for it is generally conceded. The public does not concern itself as to the manner of procuring cadavers, nor of the extent of demand for them, except when an accidental exposure is made, which is offensive to common decency. So not much has changed." In this talk, I'll give an overview of body snatching in Old Washington and describe the career of two of the more colorful practitioners. In 1894, Robert Smiley published a guidebook called A Glimpse at the Night Side of Washington. Among the diversions he suggested for the sophisticated gentleman was tracking the elusive Washington ghoul. During the fall and winter months, the night prowler may visit the small and unprotected cemeteries in the Potter's Field, where he will perhaps see the ghoul's wagon and the men themselves at work. You can see the wagon drive to the rear of the medical college about 2 or 3 o'clock a.m. If you have $20 to spare, you may be able to buy the privilege of accompanying them on their next trip. But you must overcome their suspiciousness, which is hard to do. When grave robbing was on the wane, Dr. Johnson Eliot, himself a grave robber, wistfully remembered, "There were pleasures and fascinations and excitements and risks attending grave robbing that were not found in any other phase of the study of medicine." The golden age of Washington grave robbing lasted from the end of the Civil War to the early 20th century. Before the Civil War, the local medical schools had relatively few students, and therefore they needed relatively few cadavers. And the Civil War made grave robbing unnecessary for the duration. The main local customers for bodies were George Washington University, formerly Columbia College, from 1825, Georgetown University, formerly Georgetown College, from 1849, Howard University from 1869, and some shorter-lived schools as well. The Army Medical Museum and the Smithsonian Institution also bought corpses for study. Where there's a demand, there will be a supplier. For most of the 19th century, D.C. had no clear laws against grave robbing. The courts punished grave robbers for trespass, for burglary, or for violation of health law, which would be moving a corpse through the city without a permit. Laws to give medical schools unclaimed bodies were repeatedly proposed but failed in Congress. An 1895 act gave schools access to a few bodies, but grave robbing continued since the students used about 50 bodies a month, and they only got about 5 a month legally. A 1902 law finally let medical colleges claim the bodies of people who were to be buried at public expense. After this, body snatching largely disappears from the newspaper, but it continues even today up to some extent. Body snatching began with the identification of a suitable corpse. Spotters located candidates by reading the newspapers in the obituary column, attending funerals, or asking physicians, hospital staff, or undertakers. Some bodies didn't even make it to the cemetery, and grave robbers occasionally reported digging up coffins that were filled with rocks. Experienced grave robbers had a set of tricks which they used to make their work go more smoothly. They would, for example, remove all of the grave decorations and flowers off the grave mound and set them aside in the exact position next to it. They would excavate the dirt over the head of the coffin only, the whole coffin. They broke open the coffin, put a rope around the corpse's neck, or a metal hook under the jaw or in the mouth of the corpse, and then pulled it out. The hole was then refilled, the decorations put back in their original position, and the body was taken to the customer. Professional grave robbers usually obtained between $15 and $20 per body on average. Amateurs without any connections in the schools got as little as $2. The cemetery attached to the Washington Asylum. The Washington Asylum was actually a complex that included a jail, a workhouse, and a poorhouse. And it's in the reservation that contains today RFK Stadium and DC General Hospital. It's also known as Potter's Field. This was the main source of corpses for the Washington grave robbers. And if you can see the almshouse, it would be the area in to the west or to the right of that. I'm sorry, to the east. There's an example of what the burials would have looked like. This is about 1905. Dr. Charles Purvis, the director of Freedman's Hospital, which was the antecedent to Howard University Hospital, said, "I know that no body remains in the Potter's Field overnight, and that Howard Medical School would refuse to take a body stolen from any but the asylum cemetery." And of course, the faculty had to depend on the grave robber's word as to the origin of the corpse. Whenever the asylum staff was burying a body which they thought might be claimed by relatives, they buried it in an especially deep grave and covered it with heavy stones in order to prevent premature resurrection. After Potter's Field, the major sources for bodies were Holmead Cemetery, which was at the corner between 18th and 19th on S Street, Ebenezer Colored Methodist Cemetery near Congressional, Columbian Harmony Cemetery at 800 Rhode Island Avenue Northeast. But nearly every cemetery in D.C. and in the nearby suburbs was raided at one point or another. The number of bodies dug up is unknown, but it was certainly very large. Dr. Purvis claimed that he knew a dozen active professional resurrectionists. Viggo Jensen claimed to have stolen 500 bodies between 1877 and 81, mostly for Georgetown. George Marlowe said he resurrected 340 bodies in 1 year, which was 1892, of which only 140 came from Potter's Field. Some robbers even set up mail-order businesses to supply the mortal remains of our fellow Washingtonians to medical schools around the country. The bodies of African Americans were stolen more frequently than those of whites. In the sources that I found between 1841 and 1911, which mention race, 11 of the bodies were white and 42 were black. This disparity was due in part to the fact that more blacks than whites were buried in the Potter's Field. Blacks also lacked the economic and political power to prevent these kind of robberies, although on occasion ad hoc groups were created to protect cemeteries after recent burials. One robber claimed that he had never stolen the body of a white person, which he later amended to a white female, and another told a reporter that he only stole white bodies on special order. But these claims were only made to reassure a white audience. They took, in fact, whatever bodies were available. Of the body snatchers that I've been able to identify, 23 were white and 25 were black, and that included Cato Ward, who was an assistant at Georgetown University, and a pastor in the AME Church. Before the rise of professional grave robbers, bodies were generally stolen by the medical school teachers and the students. Dr. Thomas Sewell, who was a founding member of George Washington University's medical school, was convicted of body snatching in Massachusetts before coming to Washington in 1820. And Dr. Llewellyn Elliott, who I mentioned a minute ago, said he was a body snatcher as his father, Dr. Johnson Elliott, had been, who was also a founder of the Georgetown Medical School, by reasons of his duties as demonstrator, afterward professor of anatomy at both Georgetown and George Washington. He said that his father remained the friend and protector of the legitimate body snatcher until his death. I don't know what an illegitimate body snatcher would have been. In a 1916 lecture, Dr. Elliott told funny stories to his audience of doctors about the grave robbing carried on by the Georgetown faculty, such as how in 1856 one doctor had to beg his colleagues not to steal the body of his recently deceased sister. This is an example of a dissecting room scene. This is at the University of Maryland, Baltimore campus. I could not find any photos of dissecting rooms in the time period for DC, although some exist from Howard from a little bit later in the teens. It was believed that when body snatchers could not get corpses, they killed people for their bodies. This was called burking after William Burke, who was a Scotsman who killed people for dissecting purposes in the 1820s. Viggo Jensen claimed that he was frequently offered fresh subjects for a price, but declined. Resurrectionist Dr. Selden Crow told a reporter, "I am stealing stiffs, and when I steal and will steal live ones if dead ones are scarce." Dr. David Schlemer, a physician who was employed by the city to care for the poor in the 1870s, was a grave robber and was accused of killing patients for their bodies. In 1964, Dr. W. Montague Cobb, who was the head of the anatomy department at Howard University, denied that people had ever been killed for their bodies in Washington, saying that as a native DC resident, he would have certainly have heard of such a thing, but on the other hand, he was an anatomist, and therefore he might have had a reason to cover up any information he had about that. Considering the involvement of doctors in grave robbing, it's not surprising that the black community long had a very suspicious relationship with the medical profession. My favorite body snatchers were Maud and Percy Brown. These were two of the hardest working members of the Washington underworld, and they had a career spanning more than 3 decades. Percy's relation to Maud was always somewhat ambiguous. He was variously represented as her husband or her brother, and he may have been both. Maud's only semi-legal profession was telling fortunes. She impressed many people with a very cultured tone of speech and her obvious education, but her appearance was nightmarish. She was described as a shriveled up little woman with a face horribly scarred, from which gleamed a single sightless eye, the other being entirely lacking. Her face was concave on one side and convex on the other. Her nose was long and thin, her lips sunken. Maud's consort, Percy, was called as hardened a sinner as could be found in Washington. He worked part-time as a curb setter and a printer, and he was a mean drunk, but a very good fighter. When he was still close to 70, he was teaching sparring at a saloon on 13th Street in Hooker's Division. The Browns first appeared in D.C. in 1873 when they were arrested on a charge of performing an abortion and committed to a year in jail. A few weeks into her sentence, Maud said that the imprisonment was the luckiest thing that had ever happened to them, since it cured her of a 30-grain-a-day morphine habit. Percy's opinion is not recorded. After their release from jail, the Browns went into the resurrection business with Dr. George Christian. Dr. Christian's most noted achievement was digging up the body of Beau Hickman, who was a dissipated Virginia man about town in Washington. Hickman's body, parts of which were found in the graveyard, was treated in a particularly gruesome manner. The arms had been removed at the shoulder joints, the legs amputated at the hip joints, and the head cut off, all of which had been carried away. The head had been skinned and done by so skillful a hand as to leave the features of the face recognizable. The breast had also been opened and the heart removed. It is believed from the skillful manner in which the face was skinned that a professional surgeon had a hand in the job. Now, a similarly skinned face had been found on the Capitol grounds a few weeks earlier, and since Christian was known to have stolen a head from the asylum cemetery the night before, he was probably responsible for that little prank as well. Christian had previously worked as a physician for the pension office and served a term in jail for stealing a body from Holbein Cemetery. He was also a Georgetown alumnus. In November 1874, a shipping box was left at a DC Express office for delivery to Cincinnati. When the box broke open accidentally, 2 policemen looked inside and found the bodies of 2 black women who it turned out had been recently buried at the asylum cemetery. They tracked the body to its source, which was Maud and Percy's shanty at 1327 East Capitol Street. The building is now gone. There they found Dr. Christian and the Browns with 11 shipping boxes, digging equipment, and shrouds and grave clothing. It seems they had developed an extensive business supplying both local and out-of-town customers. At trial, Christian's lawyers argued that their client had committed no crime since he had benefited science, and that without such activities, medicine would cease to progress. But the court sentenced him to a $1,000 fine and a year in jail, and the Browns were held as witnesses for 5 months. In 1880, Percy was convicted of blackmail, which landed him another year in jail. For a time, he had to give up his cell to Charles Guiteau, the assassin of President Garfield. Percy resented being displaced and later threatened to dig up Guiteau's body and sell it to the highest bidder. In the meantime, Maud became friendly with Mrs. Sarah Burlingame, whose husband Franklin was an outspoken advocate of free love. When he moved out of his family home to join his mistress, Maud moved into the house and into Sarah's bed. Mr. Burlingame described Maud as an unpleasant, dirty, pipe-smoking woman who was almost constantly under the influence of laudanum, and he overheard her and his wife making plans to rent a house where they would carry out their ideas of free love. Sarah charged him with desertion. He blamed Maud for alienating his wife's affections, and the affair ended in a very messy divorce. Maud had an unexpectedly amorous side to her, and in her old age she claimed to have married 4 separate husbands. Once he got out of jail, Percy returned to his regular employment at Georgetown. In January 1888, a body was discovered missing from Mount Olivet Cemetery, northeast. The detectives immediately headed for the Brown Shanty at 3rd and Massachusetts Avenue Northeast. That's what it looked like then. This is what it looks like now. And arrested Percy on suspicion of grave robbing. They also discovered a sort of cave dug into the rear of the house in which they found shovels and blood-stained clothing, but no bodies. Percy was released for a lack of evidence, but in an interview with the paper, Maud defended their profession. What I can't understand is why such persons as Percy and I are ostracized from society. Any young doctor who cuts the body to pieces would be welcomed in almost any family if he wanted to pay his attention to the young lady. But we who do the least repulsive part of the work are not recognized by anybody. It is work that is absolutely necessary, and when one has this sufficiently impressed upon their minds, the prejudice with which the profession is usually regarded vanishes, and instead of ghouls, as grave robbers are generally called, the public would only see earnest workers in the cause of science, doing as much in their humble way for its promotion as the students who do the revolting work of just dissecting the bodies. In the 1890s, the Browns lived at a tenement called Ryder's Castle at 419 New Jersey Avenue Northwest. That was only a few doors away from the 6th Precinct police station. The building was notorious as a place of crime, squalor, and faded gentility, where cheap women fleeced drunken pensioners. In 1894, Percy suffered a stroke and retired from business, but a younger generation still sought him out as a partner. 2 years later, the city condemned the building, and the Browns moved to their Navy Yard, but their legacy at Ryder's Castle lived on. In 1899, a decayed corpse was found in the basement coal vault, and initially the police suspected it was one of Percy's leftovers, but finally decided the body had been left there after he left. Nice place. In 1901, Percy, now 84 years old, was arrested for stealing a watch near Montello Northeast, where he lived under a tree. Because of his age and infirmity, the judge dismissed the case and Percy vanishes from the records. Maud last appeared in 1904 when she was living at 1512 Queen Street, which is formerly Turner Street, next to Gallaudet University. Her house was suspiciously close to a graveyard, and her neighbors, who believed that she was still working for the medical colleges, attacked and beat her. Her ultimate fate is unknown. The Browns' activities lingered in Washington local folklore into the 1960s, when their house, or at least their neighborhood, on East Capitol Street was still being pointed out as the haunt of body snatchers. With the passing of the Browns came an end to the golden age of Washington grave robbing and one of DC's earliest and most successful recycling programs.